I remember the fall of 2016 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin in northern Michigan with my dog, Max. I was 32 then, and life felt heavy after a string of long work weeks. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a single-room wooden place that my cousin let me use. It sat about 20 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by endless pine and oak trees, with a gravel road that turned muddy when it rained. The idea was to get away from people, to breathe quiet air for a while, and to let Max run free without the sound of traffic or the pressure of city sidewalks. The first couple of days felt almost perfect. The mornings were cool, the sky gray, the smell of damp leaves mixing with smoke from the small wood stove I kept running in the cabin. Max wandered around the clearing, sniffing through brush piles, sometimes chasing squirrels until they darted up the trees. I'd take walks with him down a narrow path that led to a shallow stream about a mile out. The sound of the water trickling over stones felt like something I hadn't heard in years. At night, I'd light a lantern, eat simple food, and listen to the stillness. Max would curl up near the door, his chest rising and falling slow. By the fourth day, things started to feel different. I noticed how quiet the woods got at certain times, especially late in the afternoon, as though everything living had gone somewhere else. I'd step outside with Max, and instead of the usual calls of birds or rustling squirrels, there would just be a heavy silence, broken only by the wind shifting through the tall pines. Even Max seemed to notice. He'd stop in the clearing, ears up, staring into the tree-line like something had caught his attention. Sometimes he'd give a low growl, not loud, but enough to make me pause. I told myself he was just catching the scent of a deer or maybe a coyote, but the unease in my stomach kept growing. That evening, I walked down the path toward the stream with Max beside me. The air was colder, a wet chill settling in. The forest floor was soft with pine needles, and my boots sank slightly as I moved. I kept noticing faint marks along the ground, deep impressions in the mud. At first, I thought they were deer tracks, but the shape was off. They looked more like boot prints, though uneven, like someone dragging their feet. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. My stomach tightened at the thought of someone else being out here. This wasn't exactly a hiking spot, and the cabin was supposed to be on private land. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Max paced more than usual. Every time he circled near the door, I'd hear his nails tap against the wood. I kept the lantern burning longer than I meant to, just to see the inside walls of the cabin, as though the glow itself might keep away whatever nagged at me. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke suddenly to the sound of Max barking, deep, sharp barks that echoed hard inside the cabin. My heart kicked against my ribs. I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf, switched it on, and pointed it through the small front window. The beam cut across the clearing. Nothing moved, just the outline of the trees standing like black walls around us. Max kept barking, head low, teeth showing, his body stiff. I didn't go outside. I couldn't make myself. I just sat there with the flashlight in one hand and my other hand on Max's back, feeling his muscles locked tight. After a while, he stopped barking and sat near the door, but his ears stayed forward, listening. I didn't sleep much after that. Every sound of the cabin creaking made me flinch. The next morning, I forced myself to step outside. The cold hit me quick, but what made me stop was the ground in front of the cabin. The dirt and leaves were disturbed, scuffed around like someone had been walking circles during the night. I bent down and saw boot marks, clear as day, right near the door, as though someone had stood only a few feet away from where I slept. My throat went dry. They were real footprints, larger than mine, pressed deep into the earth. I followed them a little way, but they faded off into the woods in uneven strides. All day, I couldn't shake the thought of someone out there. Every noise, branches snapping, a crow cawing, made me turn my head. Max stayed close more than usual. He hardly wandered, He seemed to understand something wasn't right. That night, the air dropped close to freezing. I fed the wood stove more than usual, keeping the inside warm. Max laid near my feet, his eyes half shut but ears twitching. I sat with the lantern burning low, staring at the door. Hours dragged by, and then Max suddenly lifted his head. He growled, low, steady, staring at the door again. My heart jumped. I killed the lantern and grabbed the flashlight. I stood there in the dark, barely breathing. Then came the sound, footsteps outside. Slow, heavy, circling the cabin. Leaves crunching, wood snapping under the weight of someone moving. My chest felt like it might cave in. Max was barking now, loud, wild. I pointed the flashlight through the window, but the glass just reflected my own pale face back at me. I didn't open the door. Couldn't. The footsteps moved closer, stopping just outside. I could hear breathing. I swear I could faint, but there, I stood frozen for what felt like forever. And then, just as sudden, the sound drifted off into the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the pale morning light came, I opened the door with Max pushing past me. The ground showed the tracks again, circling the cabin, pausing at the door, like someone testing it. I scanned the tree line with shaking hands, gripping the flashlight even though the sun was up. Whoever it was, they hadn't come inside. Maybe they didn't want to force the door. Maybe they were just waiting. That was enough for me. I packed what little I had, stuffing clothes into my backpack, throwing out the food I couldn't carry. Max stayed at my side, restless, almost pulling me toward the trail. I didn't even bother to sweep the cabin or shut it tight. I locked the flimsy door, knowing it wouldn't stop anyone, and started the long walk down the gravel road toward where I had left my truck, nearly 2 miles away. Every sound in the woods behind me made my skin crawl. I kept looking back, half expecting to see a figure following. Max kept pulling forward, his tail low, ears up, nose twitching. I walked faster than I thought I could, heart pounding the whole time. By the time I reached the truck, my hands were shaking so hard it took me 3 tries to get the keys into the lock. I threw my pack inside, let Max jump in, and started the engine. The sound of it roaring to life felt like the safest thing I'd heard all week. Driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror. Nothing followed. Nothing appeared on the road behind me. Still, I didn't stop until I reached the highway, where cars passed and the world felt alive again. I never went back to that cabin. A month later, my cousin asked if I had enjoyed the place, and I just said it wasn't for me. I didn't tell him about the footprints, the circling, the breathing outside the door. To this day, I don't know who it was or what they wanted. All I know is that it was real, and it was enough to make me understand how fragile the line between safe and unsafe can be when you're alone in the woods. Max is older now, his muzzle gray, but I still remember how he stood guard that night, how his growls told me before I ever heard a sound that something was there. Without him, I don't know if I would have had the nerve to stay inside. He was the reason I made it through, the reason I left when I did. And I will never forget the sound of those footsteps circling in the dark. After my ex-wife, Claire, passed away in 2016, I found myself holding on to places more than people. She and I had been divorced for nearly 7 years by then, and though we had long stopped speaking, the news of her sudden death hit me in a way I couldn't explain. We had shared nearly a decade together, most of it in rough patches, but also some moments of calm. After the funeral, I felt a pull to retreat somewhere isolated, a place where I could sit with everything and maybe sort through the guilt that followed me like a shadow. That's how I ended up driving to the small cabin my uncle had left me in northern Minnesota, a place I hadn't been to in over 15 years. The drive was long, and as I got deeper into the forests off Highway 2, I remembered why I hadn't bothered to return before. The road narrowed, The air grew colder, and the sky seemed heavy, always leaning low over the tree line. By the time I reached the dirt path that led to the cabin, the sun was already slipping behind the trees. The path was muddy from recent rain, and my truck bounced over the ruts as I crawled along until the roof of the cabin finally showed between the pines. The cabin was small, one-story, built in the 1960s. It had a wraparound porch, though half the railing had rotted through. The roof shingles were dark with moss, and the windows were filmed over with grime. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood, the kind of smell that never leaves a place no matter how much you clean it. I dropped my bag on the couch that sagged in the middle and stood in silence for a while, listening. The only sound was the groan of the trees in the wind and the faint tapping of branches against the roof. I had brought supplies for 3 nights: canned food, bottled water, some firewood. My plan was simple: stay there, clear my head, and then leave. But as soon as darkness came, I knew I'd made a mistake. The woods around the cabin didn't feel empty the way woods usually do. They felt tight, as though something was always standing just beyond my sight. That first night, I lay on the bed in the back room, staring at the ceiling. The cabin walls were thin, and every noise outside pressed through them. The crack of branches, the shuffle of leaves, the long sigh of the wind. Around midnight, I heard something heavier, like the crunch of footsteps in the gravel near the porch. I froze. My uncle had told me once that hunters sometimes trespassed near his land, but the sound wasn't distant. It was right outside. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, and listened as the sound circled the cabin slowly. Gravel shifted, then wood creaked the porch. My skin prickled. I stayed absolutely still, waiting for a knock at the door or a hand at the window, but nothing came. After what felt like an hour, the sound faded into the trees again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been an animal. Maybe a deer wandering close, maybe a bear sniffing around. But when I stepped outside, I saw clear shoe prints in the mud near the porch. They weren't fresh boots either. They were worn down at the heels, the tread nearly gone. Someone had been walking around the cabin. I told myself not to panic, but I couldn't shake the unease. I spent the day chopping some of the firewood, anything to stay busy. The trees felt too quiet when I stopped working, as if the whole forest was listening. By evening, I was back inside, sitting by the small wood stove with a can of soup heating on top. I kept glancing at the window, waiting. When night dropped, the woods seemed to close in tighter than before. I locked the door, checked it twice, and tried to settle into the couch. The footsteps came again, this time slower, deliberate. They circled once more, moving from window to window. My breath was shallow as I crouched low on the couch, staring at the door. At one point, something scraped against the siding, like a hand dragging along the wall. My chest thudded so hard I thought whoever was out there could hear it. I stayed frozen until dawn's first gray light started creeping through the cracks in the curtains. When I finally stepped outside, the prints were there again, deeper in the mud this time and circling the whole cabin. I counted them, and it looked like whoever it was had walked around the place at least 5 times. That second day, I considered leaving. I could pack up, drive back out to the highway, and be gone before nightfall. But something about that felt worse, like if I left, I'd be turning my back on whoever had been out there, and they'd just keep following. I told myself maybe it was some drifter passing through, maybe some hunter looking for shelter. Still, the thought that they had never tried to knock, never tried to speak, made it worse. Whoever it was didn't want to be known. I tried not to think of Claire, but I did. She'd hated the woods, hated silence. She always needed people around her. I wondered what she would have thought of me now, sitting alone in a cabin, scared out of my skin. That night, I didn't lie down. I sat at the table with my uncle's old hunting knife in front of me, listening. The wind rattled the porch door. Around 1 in the morning, I heard the steps again. This time they came right up to the window nearest me. The thin curtain shifted slightly, as if someone's breath had moved it. I gripped the knife and stared, but the glass stayed dark. Then came the sound of the porch boards bending under weight. The steps moved to the door. I held still, waiting for a knock, waiting for the handle to turn. But there was only silence. Then a slow dragging, like fingernails scraping across the wood. Then nothing. Hours passed, and I never moved from the chair. When morning came, I walked the yard and found the same shoe prints. But this time there were more, scattered around the edge of the clearing, as though the person had been pacing back and forth, deciding something. My stomach sank. By the third day, my nerves were raw. I hadn't slept properly, and every sound made me jump. I knew I couldn't take another night of it. I packed my things into the truck, but before I left, I walked down the trail that led deeper into the woods, just to see if I could spot where the prints led. The mud was softer in that direction, and the tracks were easy to follow. They wound down past the creek, then disappeared into a patch of dry leaves. I kept walking, and that's when I saw it. A tarp stretched between two trees, half collapsed. Under it was a small bedroll, a pile of empty cans, and a pair of old shoes with the soles worn smooth. Whoever had been outside my cabin had been living right there, less than 200 yards away. The tarp was damp, the bedroll flattened, but the cans were recent. Whoever it was hadn't left long before I came down the path. My skin crawled as I turned back. I didn't take anything, didn't touch a thing. I just walked quickly back to my truck, loaded up, and drove until the cabin was gone behind me. I never went back. The cabin still belongs to me, but I don't plan to return. What scared me most wasn't that someone was there. It was that for 3 nights they had walked around my cabin, close enough to touch the walls, and never once tried to speak or show themselves. They had wanted to watch, nothing else. And knowing how close they had been, knowing how long they might have been staying there, was worse than anything I could have imagined. That's the last memory I'll ever make in that place. The cabin can rot into the dirt for all I care. I was 31 when I decided to spend a few nights in the small wooden cabin that stood just past the edge of an old graveyard in rural Kentucky. It was the spring of 2016, and I had been working long weeks at a factory job that left me worn down and restless. A friend had mentioned the cabin months earlier, saying it was used years ago by a groundskeeper who looked after the cemetery but had been abandoned after he passed. The land wasn't exactly hidden, but it was tucked away behind a thick line of trees that separated the graveyard from the hillside. I wanted to get away, to have quiet, to be on my own without hearing machines or voices for a while. That was all I was looking for. The place was simple, just 4 walls of weathered boards, a roof that sagged slightly in the middle, and a single door with a latch instead of a lock. Inside, it had a small wood stove, a cot with a thin mattress, and a crooked shelf where rusted tools still sat. The smell inside was strong, a mix of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, like rust. I remember running my hand across the windowsill, the grit of dirt sticking to my palm. Felt lonely in there, but not in a bad way. Behind the cabin, the hill sloped down into the graveyard. The rows of stones stretched far, with some leaning and cracked, others new and smooth. The older ones were so weathered I could barely make out names or dates. The newer section was closer to the road, where families still came and left flowers. In the back, near the cabin, it felt like no one had visited in years. The ground was uneven, stones pushed sideways by tree roots, and brambles crept up over the names. It was quiet except for the occasional crow or the sound of wind through the weeds. I set up my things inside the cabin: sleeping bag, a lantern, a small cooler of food. I didn't have much, just enough to last 3 days. The first evening was calm. I sat outside the cabin and watched the light fade over the headstones. The air cooled quickly, and the ground smelled damp. By the time I went in, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. That night, the rain started. It wasn't a heavy downpour at first, just a steady tapping on the roof. Lying on the cot, I listened to it and tried to sleep. The sound was almost soothing until I noticed another noise under it. A faint scraping like metal on stone. I lay there still, thinking it was maybe a branch dragged by the wind. But the sound kept coming, slow and deliberate, then stopping. After a while, I told myself it was just something shifting in the graveyard. The old stones were cracked, leaning, maybe one had toppled. I forced myself not to dwell on it, but my body stayed tense for hours before I finally drifted off. The second day was colder. Clouds hung low, and the rain came and went. I walked through the cemetery in the late morning, trying to shake off the unease from the night. The ground was soft and muddy, pulling at my boots. In the far corner, a few graves had collapsed slightly inward, the earth sunken in as if washed out by years of rain. I noticed fresh marks in the mud near one of the stones, boot prints, deep ones. I hadn't seen anyone else around since I got there. The prints were sharp, pressed down recently, not washed out like old ones. I stared at them longer than I should have, then told myself someone must have passed through, maybe a hunter or just a local cutting across the hill. When I went back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the thought that whoever left them might still be around. I closed the door that night instead of leaving it half open for the breeze. I set the latch, which was little more than a strip of bent metal, and kept the lantern close. The rain picked up again, heavier than the night before, pounding against the roof until water leaked through cracks and dripped into the dirt floor. I lay listening to the storm until I thought I heard that scraping again. This time it was closer, and in between gusts of wind, it sounded like someone dragging something heavy across the ground. I didn't sleep much. Every sound outside felt sharper, more deliberate, as though it wasn't the weather at all. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard the crunch of footsteps in the wet soil outside the cabin. I held my breath. The steps moved slowly, circling, stopping now and then like whoever it was listening, too. My skin prickled, my body stiff with fear. I didn't move from the cot, but I gripped the lantern so tightly my knuckles hurt. The steps stopped right outside the door. I stared at the wood, waiting to see the latch shift. Nothing happened. Minutes dragged, but I couldn't hear breathing, couldn't hear anything but the rain. Eventually, I realized whoever it was had stepped away. The sound faded toward the graveyard, swallowed by the storm. The next morning, when the rain slowed, I went outside. The mud was torn with tracks. They were heavier than mine, longer strides, and they circled the cabin twice before heading back toward the graves. My stomach dropped as I followed them. They led between 2 older stones, then stopped at a sunken patch of ground where one of the graves had partially collapsed. The earth there looked disturbed, darker, as though someone had been digging. I backed away, every part of me tense. Whoever had been there at night wasn't just passing through. They were doing something in the cemetery. I thought about leaving right then, but the road was a long walk from the cabin, and the rain was starting again. My car was parked down the slope near the road, but to reach it I would have to cross half the graveyard. Something in me decided it was safer to stay until morning. That night was the longest of my life. The storm raged harder, and the cabin creaked with every gust. I sat on the cot, lantern lit, listening. Sometime past midnight, I heard the footsteps again. They came slower this time, heavier, as if dragging weight. They circled the cabin once more. I gripped the lantern, but I didn't move. At one point, I thought I heard something lean against the wall, boards straining under the pressure. My chest hurt from how hard my heart was pounding. The footsteps didn't leave quickly this time. They lingered, pacing back and forth outside until I thought I would break from the tension. When they finally faded, I sat awake until morning, never closing my eyes. As soon as daylight came, I packed everything, barely stuffing it into my bag. The rain had stopped, leaving mist over the graves. I stepped out, nerves raw, and moved fast down the path. I kept my eyes on the ground, afraid to look at the stones around me. When I reached the spot where the grave had been disturbed, I saw it clearer in the gray light. The soil had been dug up again during the night, piled on the sides in wet heaps. Something large had been pulled out, maybe a box, maybe a container. The tracks led away from it, into the trees, vanishing into the thick brush. I didn't stop walking. My boots slid in the mud, but I forced myself faster until I reached the car. The sight of it nearly made my legs give out. I unlocked it, tossed everything in, and drove away without looking back. I never told anyone the full story, only said the cabin was too damp, too close to the graveyard for comfort. But I know what I heard and saw. Someone had been digging in those graves at night, circling the cabin while I lay inside. They were close enough to touch the walls. The cabin is still there, as far as I know, standing crooked behind the line of trees. I have never once thought about going back. The image of those disturbed graves and the sound of footsteps in the mud is enough to keep me away for the rest of my life. I was 28 when I decided to stay at the old farm cabin in southern Iowa during the fall of 2004. My uncle had owned the place for decades, but it had been sitting unused for years, tucked far back from the county road, hidden by cornfields and a stretch of timber. He let me use it whenever I wanted, and I figured a weekend alone would be a good way to get away from work and the noise of the city. It wasn't much of a cabin, just a square wooden structure with one bedroom, a kitchen area, and a small wood stove in the corner. The roof sagged a little, the walls had dark stains from water leaks, and there was always a faint smell of dust and old hay clinging to the air, but I liked that it was isolated. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and the gravel road was barely traveled at that time of year. I drove up late in the afternoon, the sun dropping low and casting long shadows across the harvested fields. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt track, half hidden by trees, with an old barn a short walk behind it. The barn had holes in its siding, broken boards rattling in the wind, and a hayloft door that hung crooked, like it could fall off any time. I parked my truck in the grass and unloaded some supplies. Sleeping bag, lantern, a cooler with food, and a small axe I kept in the back. The air had that dry chill of October, with the kind of silence you only hear in the countryside, where even the wind seems to hesitate. Inside, the cabin was colder than outside. Dust floated in the fading light that came through the windows. A few old chairs leaned against the wall, and a thin mattress lay across the wooden frame of the bed. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and when I set down the cooler, the sound echoed louder than I expected, as if the place was holding its breath. I opened the shutters to let more light in, but the trees blocked most of it. By the time I lit the lantern, night was already pushing against the windows. The first night passed quietly. I built a small fire in the stove, cooked a can of beans, and listened to the wind brushing against the siding. The sound of the barn creaking now and then carried through the night, but that was nothing unusual. Old buildings make noise. I crawled into the sleeping bag around 11, staring at the shadows stretching across the ceiling. The silence got heavier once the fire burned low, broken only by an occasional thump from the rafters. I told myself it was probably just a raccoon or a bird nesting somewhere. When I woke up the next morning, there were fresh tracks in the dirt outside the cabin. They were boot prints, not mine. The soil was dry, so the outlines weren't sharp, but they circled around the porch and led off toward the barn. I walked over to check, carrying the axe loosely in my hand. The barn door swung gently when I pushed it, revealing piles of rotting hay, broken tools, and a ladder leading up to the loft. Dust shifted in the beams of sunlight, and I could hear something scurrying deeper inside, probably a rat. Still, the boot tracks made me uneasy. Nobody should have been out there, and I hadn't heard a truck or seen lights on the road. The day went slowly. I tried to read a book I had brought, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. Every sound outside seemed sharper, like branches snapping or leaves crunching. Around midday, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for more prints. They stopped near the treeline, then vanished into the grass. I stood there for a while, staring into the woods, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. That night was worse. I had built up the fire and was lying in the sleeping bag when I heard the crunch of footsteps outside. They weren't fast, just slow, steady steps circling the cabin. The boards of the porch creaked under weight that wasn't mine. I sat up, holding the axe, heart hammering so hard I thought it would echo through the walls. The lantern was still burning, casting faint light, but I didn't dare put it out. The steps moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped. The silence afterward was heavier than the noise. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the door creaking open or the window shattering. By dawn, I felt drained. I went outside quickly, scanning the dirt, and sure enough, there were more boot prints, fresher this time. They came right up to the bedroom window and then turned back toward the barn. My chest tightened as I followed them, but the barn looked the same as before, hollow and empty. The third day dragged on. I wanted to leave, but part of me didn't want to seem paranoid. It was a farm cabin in the middle of nowhere. Maybe a hunter had passed through, or a local kid was messing around. But the prints, the pacing at night, it felt deliberate. I sharpened the axe blade with a stone I found and kept it close. As the sun dipped again, I locked the cabin door and shoved a chair under the handle. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around midnight, I heard the barn door slam against the side of the building. The sound shot through the trees like a gunshot. Then came the footsteps again, crunching slower this time, pausing as if whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. I gripped the axe so tightly my hands ached. I thought about running to the truck, but the keys were on the counter, and I'd have to pass by the windows. Instead, I stayed frozen, staring at the dark edges of the room until the steps faded back toward the barn. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, shoving everything into the cooler and bag. When I stepped outside, the air felt heavier, colder, as if the farm itself wanted me gone. I glanced toward the barn one last time, and the loft door creaked slowly, though there was no wind strong enough to move it. The drive back to the main road felt longer than usual. Every bump in the dirt track rattled through my chest. When I finally hit the gravel and saw the fields open up, relief washed over me like a flood. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't want to. Later, when I told my uncle about the prints and the sounds, he just shook his head. He said people sometimes squat in old barns, especially near harvest season, drifting workers with nowhere else to go. He hadn't been out there in years and didn't seem too concerned. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was there wasn't just passing through. They had circled the cabin night after night, standing close enough to peer through the window, close enough to listen to me breathing inside. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, when I think about those nights, I don't imagine some harmless drifter or lost hunter. I picture someone standing out there in the dark, silent, waiting, testing the door each night to see if it would give. I think about how easy it would have been for them to break the glass or force the lock. The only thing that kept me safe was that they didn't choose to come inside. That's the part that sticks with me most. Not the footsteps, not the prints, not even the slamming barn door. It's knowing they could have, but they didn't, and I'll never know why. I was 36 when I decided to spend a week alone at an old hunting cabin I had access to. It sat deep in the hills of northern Arkansas, far off the paved road, down a rough gravel track that twisted between tall pines and oaks. The cabin wasn't mine, but it belonged to an old friend of my father who had moved to Texas years back. He rarely used it anymore, and he once told me I could stay there whenever I wanted so long as I kept the place clean and locked up when I left. I needed a break from work, from everything, so I thought it was the perfect time. The drive out there was quiet, the kind of silence where you don't even see another car for nearly an hour. My phone lost its signal not long after I turned off the main highway, and I didn't expect it to come back until I returned. That didn't bother me. I wanted the silence, the woods, the escape. The cabin itself wasn't much, just a small wooden structure built back in the late 70s. The logs were weathered, the roof a little sagged, and the porch tilted slightly to the left. It looked tired but strong enough to keep me sheltered for a week. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dust. A pair of deer antlers hung above the stone fireplace, and the furniture was rough but functional. An old table with a couple of mismatched chairs, a sagging couch with a quilt thrown over it, and a small bed in the back room. There was no electricity, only a couple of gas lamps and a stack of candles. The water pump out back worked if you poured a little to prime it, and there was an outhouse about 20 yards away. Felt like stepping back in time, and for a while I liked that feeling. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent most of the time walking the trails around the cabin, fishing at a nearby stream, and chopping some extra firewood to keep busy. At night, I'd light the lantern, cook simple meals on the old propane stove, and read by the dim light until my eyes grew heavy. The woods had their own rhythm. I'd hear owls, coyotes yipping in the distance, and the constant hum of insects. It was lonely, but it was the kind of loneliness I thought I wanted. But by the third night, something started to feel different. I couldn't put a finger on it, but the woods seemed heavier somehow, like they were pressing against the cabin. I sat on the porch after sundown, listening. The usual sounds were there, but every so often I thought I heard something else, like the crunch of leaves just beyond the tree line. It would stop when I focused on it, then start again when I looked away. I told myself it was just deer moving through, or maybe raccoons. That's what made sense. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. The next morning, I found footprints in the soft dirt near the pump out back. They weren't mine. I could tell because I had been wearing heavy boots, and these looked different. They were lighter, narrower, and the tread didn't match mine. At first, I thought maybe they were old, left from when someone else had been here weeks or months ago. But the soil was damp from rain the day before, and the edges of the prints were sharp, not softened with time. Someone had walked through there during the night. That made me uneasy. The cabin was isolated, and I hadn't seen another person since I left the highway. Whoever it was, they had no reason to be there. I checked the lock on the cabin door and found it still bolted, but I started paying more attention after that. I carried my hatchet around the property and kept it close at night. By the fifth day, things escalated. I was returning from the stream in the late afternoon when I saw something that made my stomach turn. Stuck to the door of the cabin, wedged under the handle, was a small bundle of twigs tied together with some kind of string. At first, I thought it was just debris blown by the wind, but it was too neatly made. The sticks were broken to the same length, bound tightly. It wasn't random. Someone had placed it there on purpose. I didn't like the feeling it gave me. It wasn't a sign of trespassing. It was more like a message, but one I couldn't understand. I tossed the bundle into the woods and tried not to think about it, but I couldn't shake the thought of someone creeping around while I was gone, close enough to touch the cabin door. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every small sound seemed magnified. The creak of the logs, the tapping of a branch against the roof, the wind slipping through the trees. But then I heard something else, clearer this time. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. They were faint at first, but they drew closer until I could almost picture someone standing just outside the window. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I sat in the dark, gripping the hatchet in my hand, staring at the thin curtains. The steps stopped after what felt like forever, but I never heard them retreat. The first light, I went outside. Nothing seemed disturbed, but when I walked around the back, I found more footprints. Fresh ones. They went from the tree line straight to the back wall of the cabin and stopped there, as if the person had just stood and listened. I looked out into the woods, scanning for movement, but saw nothing. I decided I couldn't stay another night. Whatever peace I had come looking for was gone, replaced by dread. I started packing my things, but something kept gnawing at me. The idea that leaving in the middle of the day might not matter if whoever had been watching was still out there. Still, I couldn't risk the night. I loaded my pack and stepped onto the porch. The forest felt too quiet, as though it were holding its breath. I moved quickly, locking the cabin behind me out of habit, though I doubted it would stop anyone. The trail to my truck seemed longer than before, every shadow between the trees a place where someone could stand unseen. When I finally reached the clearing, relief hit me hard. My truck was still there, untouched. But as I put the key in the door, I noticed something on the driver's side mirror. Hanging from the glass was another bundle of sticks, tied together just like the one on the cabin door. My hand froze on the handle. Someone had been at my truck while I was inside the cabin. That meant they knew I was there the whole time, and they had been close enough to touch the one thing I needed to leave. I tore it off, tossed it to the ground, and got inside fast. My hands shook as I started the engine. I didn't look in the mirrors until I was halfway down the gravel road, and even then, I thought I caught glimpses of movement between the trees, though it might have just been my imagination. When I reached the highway, I felt like I had crossed some invisible border back into safety. Still, the whole drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, the bundles, the footsteps circling the cabin at night. None of it made sense, and maybe it never would. All I knew was that someone had been watching me, maybe testing me, and they wanted me to know it. I never went back to that cabin again. Even now, years later, when I think about it, I can still feel that same heavy silence pressing down, the sound of footsteps outside my window, and the sight of that small bundle hanging from my truck mirror like a warning I had barely escaped. The year was 2012 when I decided to take some time off and stay at a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. I was 32 back then, working long weeks at a shipping warehouse, and I thought a week in the woods would clear my head. I had always liked being outdoors, but this time I chose a place much more remote than where I usually went. The cabin I rented wasn't fancy. It had no running water, no electricity except for a small generator that I didn't plan to use much, and it sat off a dirt road that most people wouldn't even notice. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be alone for a while, and that is exactly what I got. The cabin was old, built out of dark logs that looked almost black when the sun went down. The windows were small, and the door was heavy and creaked each time I opened it. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dampness, like it hadn't been lived in for years. There was a stone fireplace, a small table, a bed pushed against the wall, and some shelves with a few pans and old supplies left by whoever stayed there before me. Out back there was an outhouse. The trees grew so close around the cabin that even in the middle of the day it always felt dim. I could hear the wind move through the branches, and it sounded almost like whispers sometimes. On the first night, everything was normal. I lit a lantern, made some food, and sat by the fire while listening to the woods outside. The night was cold, and I could hear coyotes far in the distance. The quiet was heavier than what I was used to. It wasn't like being at home where you could always hear cars or neighbors. Here it was only the wind, the trees, and small cracks in the wood of the cabin. When I finally laid down in bed, it felt strange, like the silence was pressing against me. But I slept. The second day I spent hiking around. I followed an old logging trail for miles, not seeing another person or any sign of life other than tracks in the mud and birds overhead. The woods seemed endless. It was peaceful but also unsettling, because I knew if anything happened, there was no one close by to help. I carried a knife on me, not because I thought I'd need it, but just for the feeling of security. When I got back, the cabin felt smaller than before, like it was closing in. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. I kept hearing something outside, small steps, light but steady, moving close and then fading away. I told myself it was probably deer walking around the clearing, but each time I shut my eyes, I felt the noise was too deliberate, too steady. At one point, I thought I heard something brush against the wall of the cabin. I held my breath and listened. The fire had died down, and the only sound was the faint creak of the wooden beams. My chest felt tight, and I stayed awake for hours staring at the ceiling, waiting for another sound. Eventually, I drifted off. On the third day, I felt tired. My head ached, and I couldn't stop thinking about what I heard. I walked the area around the cabin looking for tracks, but the ground was covered with pine needles and dry leaves, so nothing clear showed. The more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself I was letting my imagination get the better of me. I tried to focus on chopping some wood, keeping busy, but the uneasy feeling never left. That night, it became worse. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of crunching leaves just outside the window. The footsteps were slow, not rushing or nervous, just steady. I didn't move at first. I just laid there, frozen, with my blanket pulled up to my chin. Then the steps stopped right outside the wall by the bed. I could hear my own heartbeat louder than anything else. My mouth was dry, and my palms were sweating. I stared at the faint outline of the window but saw nothing. I forced myself to sit up and reach for the lantern. My hands shook so much I nearly dropped it. I lit it, the light filling the cabin with a weak yellow glow. I listened again, but the steps were gone. Just the silence again. I stayed awake the rest of the night with the lantern burning, staring at the door, expecting it to open even though it never did. By the fourth day, I started questioning whether I should leave early. I had only planned to stay a week, but I felt like I was slowly unraveling. Still, I didn't want to admit I was scared of nothing more than sounds in the woods. So I tried to hold on. I spent the day walking further down the trail, but every time I stopped to rest, I had the strong sense of being watched. I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see someone standing far down the trail. The trees all looked the same, and shadows stretched out long between them. It was hard not to picture someone just out of sight, keeping distance but always there. That night, I decided to stack some wood against the door from the inside, just in case. It wouldn't keep anyone out, but it would make noise if the door opened. I laid in bed with the lantern still lit, staring at the wood pile, barely blinking. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to a loud sound in the middle of the night. It was the sound of something scraping along the wall outside. Long, slow drags like metal or wood being pulled against the logs. My stomach dropped, and my whole body went cold. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loud. I just sat there, clutching the blanket, staring at the window. The scraping went on for a while, circling around the cabin, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I couldn't handle it anymore. My body was trembling, and I knew I couldn't last another night like that. When morning finally came, I packed my things fast. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I shoved everything into my bag, doused the fire, and stepped outside. The clearing looked different in the daylight, almost harmless. But when I walked around the cabin, my stomach turned. There were clear marks scratched into the wood. Not deep, but enough to know it wasn't some animal. Long vertical lines, uneven, made by someone dragging something along the surface. I didn't waste another second. I hiked back to where my truck was parked miles away down the dirt road, my head constantly turning, convinced someone was just behind me, staying out of view. The walk felt endless, and every time I heard a branch snap or leaves crunch, I felt my chest tighten. By the time I finally reached my truck, my shirt was soaked with sweat, even though the morning was cold. I drove away without looking back, the tires throwing up dirt and gravel. When I finally hit the main road, I pulled over and sat there with my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down. I told myself over and over that it was probably some local messing around, maybe a hunter passing by who thought it would be funny to scare someone staying out there. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a joke. Whoever it was had walked right up to the cabin, circled it, and scratched at the walls in the middle of the night while I was inside, awake and listening. I never went back to that cabin, and I never tried to rent a remote place like that again. Even now, years later, when I think about that week, I still see the scratches on the wall and hear those slow steps outside the window. It made me realize how vulnerable I was out there, cut off from everyone, with nothing but thin wooden walls between me and whoever had been moving around in the dark. It wasn't ghosts or anything from a storybook. It was something real, someone real, and that made it far worse. I drove out to New Mexico in the summer of 2012, a long stretch of road between Albuquerque and Farmington where the desert seemed endless and the air sat heavy with heat. I was 29 then, worn out from working warehouse shifts, and I thought a few days alone in the cabin my uncle had left behind would give me a break from the noise of city life. The cabin sat off a dirt road several miles from the nearest small town, tucked into a dry valley with scrub brush, pinyon trees, and red cliffs rising in the distance. It wasn't a vacation place with polished wood and neat furniture. It was more of a forgotten hideout. Dust everywhere, shelves half empty, a single bed frame with an old mattress, and a small porch that leaned with age. I got there late afternoon, just as the sun was sinking low and the sky burned orange. The air was cooler than it had been on the drive, but still dry enough that my mouth felt parched. I carried my cooler, a backpack, and a small rifle inside. I'd always been told coyotes came close out here at night, and though I wasn't planning on hunting, I felt better with something to defend myself. The cabin door creaked hard when I opened it, and the smell of dry wood and stale air hit me. I swept the floor quickly, threw my bag on the mattress, and sat on the porch to watch the light fade off the cliffs. Night in that part of the desert comes fast. One moment you see the orange glow, the next the whole valley is swallowed in shadows. The stars burned bright, far brighter than they ever did in the city. The silence pressed in harder than I expected, broken only by a faint rustle of wind through the brush. I had thought I wanted quiet, but out there, the kind of quiet I got made me feel exposed. After a while, I heard movement down the slope. At first I thought it was just a rabbit or maybe a coyote. The sound was steady, though heavy enough that I knew it wasn't small. The brush snapped, and I caught a dark outline moving low to the ground. My heart picked up, but I stayed still. The figure came closer, and in the starlight I swore it looked like a man crawling. My first thought was that maybe someone had gotten lost, some hiker from the mesas, but the way it moved was off. It crawled too fast, too close to the ground, arms and legs shifting in jerks. I stepped back inside and shut the door. The lock barely worked, so I pushed a chair against it. My hands shook when I poured myself water. I told myself it was just my imagination, that shadows and silence were playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I laid on the mattress but kept the rifle by my side. Every time I started to drift, a noise outside brought me back up. Scratches on the wall, faint crunching of footsteps circling the cabin. the sound of breathing just outside the window. The second night was worse. I tried to stay busy during the day, walking the dirt road and checking the land around the cabin, but I kept finding things that didn't make sense. In the dust near the porch, I found prints that looked half human, half animal. The heel was there, but the toes were long, almost clawed, like something had stretched them forward. I stared at them for a long time, telling myself it could be just eroded coyote tracks or something distorted by the dry dirt. But I couldn't shake the image of the figure I saw crawling. That night, I barred the windows with old planks I found in the shed and sat awake with the rifle across my lap. Around midnight, the scratching came again. This time, it was on the roof. The wood groaned under weight as if someone, or something, was crawling above me. Dust drifted down through the cracks in the ceiling, and I gripped the rifle until my knuckles hurt. Then the sound moved, crawling from one side to the other, slow and deliberate, like it wanted me to know it was there. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I went outside, and that's when I saw the prints on the roofline. Dust disturbed, long streaks like fingers dragging. My throat went dry, and I realized I wasn't just dealing with a coyote or some wild animal. Something out there knew I was inside, and it was circling me. By the third day, I started packing up, but part of me wanted to prove I wasn't just spooking myself. I stayed through another night, though every part of me screamed to leave. This time, I heard something different. It wasn't just scratching or crawling. It was a sound that froze me in place. It was my own name, drawn out low and broken, like someone trying to form words they weren't used to making. Came from the treeline not far from the porch. My chest tightened. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. Nobody should have known my name out there. I sat inside in the dark, not daring to light the lamp. The voice came again, closer, almost mocking. Then silence. Hours passed before the scratching started again. This time on the door itself, slow drags across the wood. I pointed the rifle at the door, ready to shoot at the first crack of light. My body ached from staying tense, but I never lowered it. When dawn broke, the scratching stopped. I stepped outside, careful, and found long gouges down the door, deep enough to split the wood. In the dirt, more prints circled the cabin, human-shaped, but twisted, bent, wrong. My nerves were shot. I packed everything into the truck as fast as I could, checking over my shoulder the entire time. I drove out of that valley without looking back, dirt rising behind me, hands tight on the wheel. Every mile I put between myself and that cabin felt like I could breathe again. But even now, years later, I can't forget what I saw and heard. People talk about stories of strange things in the desert. Words like skinwalker tossed around like legend. I don't claim to know what it was, but I know it wasn't an animal. I know it wasn't just shadows. The memory of those tracks, those sounds, and the way it said my name still follows me. That cabin still stands, I'm sure, but I'll never set foot near it again. Some places feel like they belong to something else, and out there in that empty valley, I learned the hard way that staying too long comes with a price. I left with my life, but I left something of myself behind too. The part that believed silence and stars in the desert meant peace. I never found peace out there. Only something watching, waiting, reminding me that not every place is meant for us. That was the last time I ever went back to the desert. I was 34 when I decided to spend a week out in the countryside, far from town, in a cabin that belonged to an older man I knew through work. He told me it was empty most of the year, and he didn't mind me using it as long as I locked up when I left. It was late September of 2012, and I had been worn down by long hours at my job and too much time around people. I thought a few nights out in the quiet, with no phone service and nothing but the woods around me, would give me the kind of rest I needed. I brought my dog, a mixed shepherd named Duke, and packed enough food, water, and firewood to last more than a week. The cabin was about 3 miles off the main road, reached by a dirt path that wound through fields and then into a thick patch of woods. It wasn't much to look at, just a squat structure of weathered wood, one small porch, and a roof patched in a few places with sheet metal. There was no power, no plumbing, only an old pump outside for water and a small outhouse behind it. That kind of simplicity appealed to me. I thought it would be easy. The first day passed quietly. I arrived before dusk, got a fire going in the small iron stove, and let Duke explore while I unpacked. The night was cool but calm, and I slept easily on the narrow cot with my dog curled up at my feet. The second day, I spent hours walking the surrounding woods, cutting through open meadows, watching the colors of early fall start to show in the trees. It was peaceful. There was no noise but the wind through the branches and the occasional crow. But on the third night, things shifted. I woke sometime past midnight because Duke was pacing at the door. His nails tapped against the wood as he moved back and forth, tail stiff, ears up. At first, I thought maybe he just needed to go outside. But when I reached for the lantern and got a dim glow across the single room, I noticed his eyes fixed on the window. He wasn't whining. He wasn't barking. He was locked on something. I moved quietly to the window and looked out, though there wasn't much to see. The moonlight broke through in patches, and the tree line looked black against the pale grass. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift in the field, just a darker shape moving along the edge of the trees, but I couldn't be sure. My pulse sped up. I stood there in silence, trying to listen over the sound of Duke's breathing, but all I caught was a faint crunch, like a footstep in the dry leaves. I stayed at the window for nearly an hour, and nothing more happened. Eventually, Duke settled again, though his body stayed pressed close to me until dawn. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it could have been a deer. I'd seen tracks near the cabin before, but I couldn't ignore the way Duke had reacted. So I kept him close on the trails and stayed nearer to the cabin. By evening, the air had a bite to it, and I sat on the porch with the lantern lit, watching the dark settle over the meadow. That's when I noticed something that unsettled me more than the night before. A small pile of rocks, stacked neatly at the far side of the clearing. It hadn't been there the previous day. I was certain of it. The stack was about knee-high, balanced in a way that looked deliberate, not like something that had fallen naturally. I walked over with Duke beside me, studied it in the fading light, then knocked it down with my boot. I didn't like it being there, like someone was leaving a mark too close to the cabin. After that, I went inside and locked the door. That night, I woke again to Duke growling low in his throat. The sound raised every hair on my arms. He stood in front of the door, body stiff, staring at it as if something was just on the other side. I sat up and stayed still, listening. Then it came, the faint scrape of something against the wood of the porch. Slow, dragging, as though someone was moving their foot across it deliberately. I held my breath and gripped the flashlight in my hand, though I didn't turn it on. The noise lasted only a few seconds, then silence again. I didn't sleep after that. The following morning, I checked the porch as soon as the sun rose. The boards showed fresh scuff marks, lighter than the rest of the weathered wood, as if someone had been dragging something across it. A stick maybe, or even a boot sole. I didn't like it. I thought about leaving, but I'd carried everything out there and told myself I might just be worked up over nothing. So I stayed. That was a mistake. On the 5th day, the woods felt different. I can't describe it better than that. Every sound seemed sharper, the wind too quiet, the branches too still. I found another pile of rocks, this one closer, set right beside the pump where I drew water. Duke knocked it over before I even touched it, barking at the ground as if it had insulted him. That night, I heard it again. Footsteps outside. Not the slow scrape this time, but steady crunches moving around the cabin. Duke snarled and scratched at the door, and I held him back by his collar. The steps circled once, then stopped, and the silence after felt even heavier. I sat with the flashlight, wide awake until the sky lightened. The next morning, I finally admitted to myself that someone was out there. It wasn't deer, it wasn't my imagination. Someone was walking around the cabin at night, stacking rocks near the places I used. I packed my things quickly, loading my bag and preparing to head out. But the dirt path leading back toward the road had changed. The ground was soft from recent rain, and in the mud I could see fresh boot prints going both ways. They weren't mine. They were too large, and there were too many. Whoever it was had been walking back and forth along the trail, close to where I would need to leave. I waited until midday, hoping whoever it was would be gone by then. The woods stayed silent. Finally, I slung my bag on my shoulder, clipped Duke's leash, and started walking. My heart pounded with every step. The prince followed the trail for nearly a mile, then veered off into the trees. I didn't look after them. I kept my eyes forward, walking faster, until I broke out of the woods and saw the faint line of the main road ahead. Relief hit me like a wave, but I didn't stop. I got to my truck, loaded Duke in, and drove without looking back. For days after, I kept replaying everything. The stacks of rocks, the scraping on the porch, the prints in the mud. Someone had been watching me out there, close enough to reach the cabin, close enough to touch the boards under my feet while I slept inside. I don't know who it was or why they didn't push further, but I understood one thing clearly as I left that place behind. I had been tested, watched like prey, and for some reason, whoever it was had let me go. I never went back to that cabin again. It was the fall of 2012 when I worked as a seasonal ranger in the northern part of Montana. I had been assigned to a small cabin that sat off a rough dirt road, almost hidden in the thick timber about 2 miles from the main station. It wasn't a fancy place, just a one-room wooden cabin with a small wood stove, a metal bed frame with an old mattress, a table, and some shelves stocked with maps, first aid kits, and gear. My job for that stretch was simple: monitor trail use, keep an eye on fire danger, and check in with hunters and hikers passing through. It was meant to be a quiet assignment, but it ended up being one of the longest nights of my life. The cabin was old, built back in the 1960s, and had the kind of smell you only get from aged wood and damp air that never quite dries. At night, the forest pressed in heavy and dark around it. The windows were small, and the single oil lamp I used inside barely lit the room, leaving the corners in shadow. Most nights I would finish my rounds on the trails and head back before dusk, chop some firewood, heat up canned stew, and write notes in the logbook. There wasn't much to it, and I didn't mind the solitude. That evening, I returned from checking a remote trail where a couple of hunters had parked their truck earlier in the day. The air was sharp and cool, carrying the damp smell of pine needles and wet dirt. When I got back, I put my pack against the wall, took off my boots, and sat down to heat up dinner on the small propane stove. The woods outside were quiet, too quiet in a way that made me uneasy. I had spent enough time in the wilderness to know that silence can be heavier than noise. Even the sound of one owl or a distant coyote was better than nothing at all. After I ate, I stepped outside to stack some wood by the door. The last of the light was fading, and the trees stood like dark walls around the clearing. That was when I noticed something odd. Just a few yards off, near the tree line, the ground had a disturbed patch, like someone had dragged their boots through the dirt. I crouched and saw deep impressions in the soft soil, but they weren't from deer or elk. They were boot prints, and they looked fresh. I hadn't seen anyone that close to the cabin all day, and the tracks hadn't been there in the morning. I followed them a short distance into the trees until they faded into harder ground. They were heading toward the narrow trail that connected to the service road. The prints were big, too. Someone larger than me wearing heavy work boots. I felt a tightness in my stomach. Maybe it was just a hiker who wandered too close. But the cabin wasn't marked on any tourist maps. Only rangers and maintenance crews were supposed to know about it. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to shake the feeling. The cabin wasn't exactly secure. The door was just wood with a simple latch, but it was all I had. I wrote a note about the tracks in the logbook, thinking I'd report it to the main station in the morning. Still, the thought of someone being close by, watching maybe, made the hair on my arms stand up. The night dragged on. I stoked the fire in the wood stove, but the popping of the logs only made the silence outside feel sharper. I kept glancing at the windows, even though I had pulled the curtains shut. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. Around midnight, I lay down on the bed with my boots still on and the flashlight next to me. I told myself I was being paranoid, but my body stayed tense. Sometime later, I heard it. A crunch in the dirt outside, slow and steady. Then another. Footsteps. My chest tightened as I lay there in the dark, straining to hear. The steps circled the cabin, one side to the other, dragging against the loose gravel. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. I reached for the flashlight but didn't turn it on. I just gripped it hard in my hand and listened as the footsteps moved toward the back wall, then paused. The cabin was so small that I could almost feel the presence on the other side of the thin wood wall. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, and I tried not to move. After a long silence, there was a slow scraping sound, like a hand or object being dragged across the wall. Then more footsteps, back around the cabin, crunching on the dirt. Whoever it was, they were circling me like a predator testing its prey. I stayed frozen on the bed, every muscle tight. Minutes dragged by, but it felt like hours. At one point, the footsteps stopped right outside the door. The handle rattled lightly, as if someone was testing the lock. My stomach twisted, and I gripped the flashlight so tight my hand hurt. I reached slowly for the small axe I kept by the woodpile inside, pulling it onto the bed. The person outside stood there for what felt like forever, then finally walked away. I listened until the sound of their boots faded into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. I kept waiting for the handle to rattle again, for the window to break, for something worse to happen. But it stayed quiet after that, just the faint sound of the wind in the trees and the crackle of the fire. When the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains, I finally got up and stepped outside. The clearing looked normal at first, but when I walked around the cabin, my stomach dropped. There were footprints everywhere in the dirt, circling the cabin again and again. They stopped at the door, at the windows, even at the woodpile. Whoever had been out there had taken their time, moving around in the dark while I lay inside, waiting. I followed the tracks back into the woods. They led to the service trail, then out toward the dirt road. At the edge of the road, I found where a vehicle had been parked. The tire marks were fresh, pressed deep into the mud. Whoever had come wasn't just a random hiker passing through. They had driven out here, parked in the dark, and walked right up to the cabin. I drove straight to the main station later that morning, told the lead ranger what had happened, and showed him the logbook entry and the tire tracks. He didn't say much, just wrote it down and told me not to spend nights alone at that cabin anymore. They never figured out who had been out there or why. Years later, I still think about that night. I think about how thin those cabin walls were, how close that person had been, just a few inches of wood between us. They could have forced their way in if they wanted to. The only reason they didn't still keeps me guessing. Maybe they wanted to scare me. Maybe they were testing how easy it would be to get inside. Maybe they planned on coming back another time. What I know for sure is that I wasn't imagining it. The prints, the rattling handle, the tracks leading back to a waiting vehicle, it was all real. That cabin was never just quiet to me again after that. It wasn't just an old ranger post in the woods. It was a reminder that the most unsettling thing out there at night isn't the animals or the storms. It's the people you don't see coming. I was 32 the year I spent a week alone at a hunting cabin in northern Minnesota. It was late October of 2014. The first snap of cold had just set in, and the woods felt empty and raw. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to a guy I knew through work who said I could use it if I wanted some time away. I took him up on it because I needed a break from the noise of the city. I thought a few days in the stillness of the woods would clear my head. The drive out took most of a day, down long stretches of two-lane roads that cut through farmland and then into thicker and darker trees. By the time I pulled onto the dirt track that led to the cabin, the sun was dropping behind the trees. The track itself was rutted and soft from the last rain, and the branches reached across it like they hadn't been trimmed in years. The cabin came into view after half a mile, sitting low and crooked in a clearing that looked like it had been hacked out of the woods decades ago. The place was rough. Old gray boards with nails sticking through, shutters hanging by one hinge, a sagging porch with weeds growing through the steps. There was a shed off to the side with a tin roof that rattled in the wind. No one had stayed here in a long time, that much was obvious. I parked near the shed, stretched my legs, and hauled my gear inside. The inside wasn't much better. Dust coated the wooden floor, cobwebs in the corners, and the air smelled damp, like old pine mixed with mouse droppings. There was a small cot in the corner, a wood stove with rusted sides, and shelves lined with jars of nails, fishing hooks, and a few rusting tools. I told myself it would do. I set down my rifle, unpacked a few cans of food, and tried to sweep the place clean with an old broom I found leaning against the wall. When night came, it came hard. No glow from towns or roads, just black pressing in from every side, broken only by the stars and the faint beam of my lantern inside. The trees outside made a constant shifting sound, creaks and knocks, like the whole forest was alive. The first night wasn't too bad. I ate, stoked the stove with a few chunks of wood I'd brought, and lay down on the cot. I didn't sleep much, though. Every small sound carried sharp through the walls. At one point, I heard something heavy move just outside the cabin. Not an animal scurrying, but weight pressing on the leaves and twigs, slow, deliberate. I froze on the cot, staring at the ceiling, hardly breathing. After a while, it went quiet again, and I finally drifted off. The next day, I went out hunting. The forest was thick and damp, with fallen leaves making a wet carpet underfoot. I followed deer tracks for miles, through gullies and across small creeks. The air smelled sharp, like rotting leaves and wet bark. I didn't see much that day, just a few squirrels, a flash of a doe far off through the trees. I headed back toward the cabin in the late afternoon, legs sore, stomach empty. As I came into the clearing, something felt wrong. My gear wasn't how I left it. The axe I had propped against the porch was lying in the dirt, and the shed door, which I'd closed that morning, was cracked open. I stood there for a while, listening, rifle in hand, but the woods were still. I walked to the shed and swung the door open. Inside, nothing looked disturbed, just old tools and a pile of rotting boards. I told myself the wind must have blown it open. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling someone had been there. That night was worse. I sat by the stove listening to the shifting in the woods. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps crunching in the clearing. They came close to the porch, paused, then circled slowly, like someone was walking the perimeter. My hands gripped the rifle so tight my knuckles hurt. The sound stopped eventually, but I didn't sleep again. By the third day, I was on edge. Every twig snap in the forest made me spin around. I barely paid attention to hunting. I kept checking the cabin whenever I left, making sure nothing had been touched. In the afternoon, I went down to a creek about a mile away to refill water bottles. When I came back, there were fresh boot prints in the mud near the clearing. Not mine, I hadn't gone that way before. The prints led toward the cabin, circled near the porch, then headed back into the woods. I didn't go inside right away. I stood in the clearing with my rifle raised, waiting, heart pounding. Nothing moved. The trees swayed, the shed roof rattled, and the prints sat there in the mud like a warning. Finally, I went inside and bolted the door with a rusted metal latch. That night, the noises came again, louder this time. Something brushed against the wall. Something heavy shifted on the porch. I didn't light the lantern. I sat in the dark with the rifle across my lap, staring at the door. Hours passed that way, the stove burning down to embers. Every creak of the wood, every faint scrape outside, made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I heard the shed door slam shut. Then silence. I sat frozen, waiting. My eyes burned from staying open so long. Finally, I stood, crept to the window and peered out. I couldn't see much, just shapes of trees and the faint line of the shed. But I knew someone was out there. I could feel it. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I decided I was done. Whatever was going on out there, I wasn't going to wait around for it to come inside. I stuffed my gear into the pack, loaded the rifle, and stepped outside. The air was icy, and frost covered the ground. In the clearing, I saw the tracks again, fresh, leading from the shed toward the woods. Bigger this time, like whoever it was had paced back and forth in the frost for a while before leaving. The hair on my neck stood up. I didn't follow them. I walked straight to the truck, threw my gear in the back, and turned the key. The road out was rough, but I didn't stop. I drove until I hit pavement again, then kept going until the cabin and the woods were hours behind me. I didn't look back. I never told the guy who owned the place what happened. I just said thanks and that it wasn't for me, but I've thought about it ever since. The prints, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched through the cracks of those old walls. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know it wasn't just animals. Someone else had been living in those woods, and they didn't like me being there. I haven't been back to a hunting cabin since. It had been raining for most of the afternoon, and by the time the sun had dropped behind the thick wall of clouds, the downpour only grew heavier. The year was 1996, and I was 28 then, restless, trying to keep myself busy by working on a small cabin deep in the woods of western North Carolina. I had been making slow progress for weeks, hauling in lumber and supplies on an old pickup, dragging what I could the last stretch down a rough dirt trail. I wanted a place of my own, a quiet spot where I could sleep, cut firewood, and spend time away from town. I had no power tools with me that day, just a handsaw, hammer, nails, and my stubbornness. The weather turned ugly fast, but I was too determined to leave. I had already sunk the corner posts into the soil and managed to get a floor frame together. I had hauled up plywood sheets for the walls, and though I knew the rain was going to ruin progress, I wanted to at least put up one wall and a roof beam before I left. I told myself it was better to fight the weather than to come back to a mess later. The rain came down so heavy that the dirt road back would turn slick, but by then I had already worked myself into the idea of staying. I had no tent, no sleeping bag, nothing but a tarp, a pack, and a flashlight. I stretched the tarp over the half-frame structure, tied it off tight between the new beams, and crawled underneath. The forest around me dripped and hissed with water, the sound of branches heavy with rain, snapping now and then under their own weight. The smell of wet pine and mud was thick in the air. It was darker under those clouds than it should have been at that hour. The rain beat the tarp hard, and every gust of wind made the frame creak. I sat on the damp plywood, feeling the cold creeping up through my jeans, and tried to picture how the cabin would look when it was finished. It helped distract me from how uncomfortable I was, but the storm outside made it hard to keep my thoughts steady. As night closed in, I realized I hadn't prepared for it at all. I had no lantern, just a cheap flashlight with fading batteries. My pack carried some bread, jerky, and water, but nothing to cook, no way to warm myself. The woods felt endless around me, with the rain drowning out everything except the occasional roll of thunder. It was the kind of sound that filled your chest, the kind that reminded you how small you were out there. I tried to lie down, curling up in my jacket, but the plywood was slick with water, and I couldn't get warm. Every drip that slipped under the tarp and hit my skin felt like ice. My flashlight lay beside me, its weak beam stretching only a few feet across the unfinished wall frame. Beyond that was nothing but the black of the storm. The more I tried to rest, the more I started to notice things. A steady crackle of branches out past the trees. The sharp sound of something snapping underfoot. I told myself it was just the rain, just limbs breaking under the weight of water, but the rhythm of it was wrong. It would come in short bursts like steps, then silence, then again closer. I sat up, heart thumping, straining to hear past the storm. The flashlight beam wobbled as I held it out toward the tree line, but it showed nothing but the curtain of rain. Still, I felt exposed, sitting there under a flimsy tarp in an unfinished frame that was hardly more than a skeleton of a shelter. I turned the light off to save the battery and sat in the dark, trying not to breathe too loud. Time dragged. The storm seemed to muffle everything, but in that muffled quiet, I caught it again: movement. Not rushing, not running, just slow, deliberate steps moving in the wet ground. I stayed still, afraid to shine the light again, afraid of what it might catch. My mind jumped to all the things it could be. A black bear, maybe a wild dog. But something about the way it moved, slow then still, didn't sit right. The smell of wet earth and pine filled my nose. But there was something else underneath it now. Faint, sour, almost like smoke or old sweat carried on the wind. I clenched the hammer in my hand and pressed my back against the frame. The night stretched on in a crawl. At one point, I swore I heard breathing. Not mine, not the storm. Something steady, slow, pulling in air like it had been waiting a long time. The hairs on my arms stood up, and my stomach twisted. I wanted to bolt, run down the muddy trail and never look back, but the dark out there felt worse than the unfinished shelter. I stayed like that until my legs cramped, until my eyes stung from trying to see through the black. Then, after what felt like forever, it stopped. The sound faded. The presence I swore I felt slipped away. The rain kept pounding. The wind shook the trees, but nothing else came. I must have dozed off sometime near dawn, curled up with the hammer still in my hand. When I opened my eyes, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the sky was turning pale gray. Everything around me was soaked, heavy with water, but the forest was quiet again, too quiet. When I finally stepped out from under the tarp, I saw it. Clear tracks in the mud just beyond the half-built wall. Not bear, not deer. Boots. Someone had been circling the cabin site during the night, walking back and forth through the rain while I hid inside. The prints were deep, fresh, leading in from the trees, looping around the frame, then vanishing back into the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, the hammer still hanging loose in my hand. My gut sank when I realized whoever it was had been close, closer than I wanted to believe. They had walked around while I sat frozen in the dark, maybe watching me from just beyond the tarp. I didn't wait around. I packed the little I had, tore down the tarp, and left the cabin frame standing there in the mud. The walk back to the road felt longer than it should have. Every step weighted by the thought of someone still out there in the dripping woods, maybe watching me leave. When I reached the truck, I threw everything in the bed and didn't look back. I never finished that cabin. I never even went back for the frame. Sometimes I think about who it was, why they were out there on that stormy night, circling a half-built shelter in the middle of nowhere. The truth is I'll never know, but I still remember that smell, faint and sour on the wet air, and the sound of footsteps where there shouldn't have been any, and that's enough. I was 30 years old in the autumn of 2016 when I rented a small cabin in the Lake District, northern England. I had been working long weeks in London, and I thought I needed some quiet and space away from the noise. The cabin was old but solid, tucked into a slope above a narrow lane, surrounded by wet ferns and stone walls dark with moss. It wasn't much, 2 small rooms, a stove, and a bed, but it had a heavy timber door and a small back garden that dropped down into a line of trees. The owner told me no one lived nearby except a couple of farms further down the road, though it felt more remote than it actually was. The week I arrived, the weather turned rough. Wind came down the valley, rattling the roof and shaking the branches against the windows at night. The rain was almost constant, tapping on the slates and dripping down through the gutters. I didn't mind at first, kept me inside with books, making tea on the stove, trying to clear my head from the city. But as the days dragged on, the silence around the cabin became heavy. When the rain stopped, it was so quiet I could hear every creak in the old floorboards, every small shift of air through the cracks in the doorframe. The first time I noticed her was late in the afternoon, just before dark. I had walked down the lane with my boots sinking in the mud, and when I came back up the track, I saw someone standing by the far end of the stone wall behind the cabin. It was a woman, thin, wrapped in a long coat that looked soaked at the hem. She had her head slightly bent, as if she was watching the ground in front of her. At first I thought she might have been a hiker who had lost her way, but when I stepped into the garden, she lifted her head and looked straight at me. Even from a distance, her stare was sharp enough to unsettle me. Her face was pale, hair dark and stringy from the rain, and she didn't move. I went inside quickly, and when I looked out again through the kitchen window, she was gone. I tried to tell myself it was nothing unusual. People walked through the valleys all the time. Maybe she was heading to one of the farms or cutting through the woods. Still, the image of her standing there lingered in my mind that night, and the cabin felt more closed in than before. Over the next 2 days, I saw her again, always at a distance, never approaching the cabin directly. Once I caught sight of her across the trees at midday, her figure partly hidden between the trunks, still and silent, watching. Another time I looked out during a break in the rain and saw her coat moving along the ridge above the lane, her steps slow, almost dragging. I never heard her footsteps, never any sound of her crossing the wet ground, just that figure showing up in the edges of my view, then disappearing again. Sleep became harder. At night, the wind scraped branches across the roof, and I kept waking up to check the windows. I started pulling the curtains tight, but I always felt like if I glanced out, I might see her standing close, her face pressed near the glass. My thoughts spiraled, and I began to wonder why she kept appearing near the cabin. If she lived nearby, she wouldn't need to circle around through the woods. If she was lost, she would have come up to the door. But she never did. She just watched. On the 4th night, I couldn't shake the sense that she was outside. The rain had eased, leaving the ground slick and quiet. I lay on the bed, listening to the stove clicking as it cooled, and I thought I heard something faint, a soft scrape like a boot sliding over wet stone. Then nothing. My chest tightened. I stayed still, waiting, staring at the ceiling in the dark. Minutes passed, then another sound, barely there, but close this time, like someone stepping on the wooden decking by the door. I forced myself up, grabbed the torch from the shelf, and stood by the window. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped the light. I pushed the curtain back a little and shone the beam out across the garden. The torch caught the stone wall, the glint of wet leaves, and then her. She was standing no more than 10 feet from the door, her coat hanging heavy with water, her face tilted slightly so the light caught the edge of her cheek and eyes. She didn't move, didn't flinch against the torch. She just stood there, staring straight at me. I froze. My mind kept trying to push some explanation. Maybe she was unwell, maybe she needed help. But the way she stood so silently, so fixed on me, drained any rational thought. I pulled the curtain shut and stepped back, my heart hammering. For the rest of that night, I didn't move from the chair by the stove, keeping the torch in my hand, waiting for the sound of her trying the door. But no sound came. When daylight finally broke, I opened the door slowly, expecting to see tracks in the mud or the imprint of boots near the decking. But the ground looked untouched, washed smooth by the rain. If she had stood there for long, I thought I would see something left behind. The emptiness only made me feel worse. I decided to leave that day. I packed my bag quickly, threw it into the back of the small car I had rented, and locked the cabin door behind me. The valley looked calm, a thin mist hanging low over the fields. But as I started the car and turned onto the lane, I checked the mirror. At the bend where the road climbed past the trees, I saw her again. She was standing at the edge of the stone wall, one hand resting on the wet moss, watching the car pull away. I didn't stop. I drove down through the valley and didn't look back again until I reached the main road toward Keswick. Only then did I breathe fully. Later, after I returned to London, I thought about it more. I never called the police because what would I have said? A woman kept standing outside my cabin? It wasn't a crime, but it felt like something worse than that. Like someone had chosen to fix themselves on me for reasons I'd never understand. I told myself it could have been anyone. Maybe someone from a nearby farm who wasn't right in the head. Maybe a drifter wandering through the hills. But what still stays with me is how she always appeared without a sound. How she stood so still in the rain, and how she never spoke, never moved closer, only watched. Even now, years later, when I think about going back to the Lake District, I stop myself. The cabin is probably still there, damp and quiet in the valley. Maybe someone else rents it on rainy weeks. Maybe they never see her. But I know what I saw, and I know the look in her eyes was not lost or confused. It was deliberate, and I'll never spend another night in that part of England again. I was 27 when I decided to spend a few days alone at a small cabin that belonged to a friend of mine. It sat deep in the woods of northern Michigan, a few miles off a narrow dirt road that cut through endless trees and low rolling hills. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a single-room structure with a small porch, no running water, and a wood stove that leaned slightly from age. My friend had told me I could use it whenever I wanted as long as I locked it up before I left. I figured it would be a quiet escape from the noise of the city and a chance to clear my head. The drive there took longer than I expected. The dirt road narrowed the deeper I went, and the woods pressed in closer. I passed a couple of old trailers, a rusting pickup on cinder blocks, and then nothing but thick trees and swampy patches on either side. The sun was low when I finally reached the cabin, the sky already changing to that dull blue-gray that comes right before darkness. The place looked lonely, sitting in a small clearing with weeds creeping up around the porch steps. I killed the engine and listened to the silence. It felt heavy, like the kind of quiet that holds its breath. Inside, the cabin smelled like dry wood and old smoke. Dust covered the table, and cobwebs hung in the corners. I unpacked my things slowly, stacking canned food on the counter and rolling out my sleeping bag on the cot against the wall. The stove took some work to get going, but once the fire caught, the cabin felt a little more alive. I ate a quick dinner straight from the can, then sat by the stove listening to the fire crackle. The wind outside moved through the trees in waves. It had that strange sound you get in deep woods, where you can't always tell if it's the wind or something moving out there. That first night, I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up to small noises. A branch snapping, dry leaves shifting, the faint scrape of something against the wood siding. Every time I sat up, it went quiet again. I told myself it was just raccoons or maybe a deer moving through. I even got up once, cracked the door, and shined my flashlight into the clearing. The light cut through the fog of my breath and fell on the empty grass and the dark wall of trees beyond. Nothing moved, but the silence felt too complete, like something had gone still just out of sight. The second day passed slowly. I spent most of it walking the trail behind the cabin, trying to shake off the unease. The woods were thick, full of wet leaves and fallen branches. A couple of times I found signs of animals. Prints in the mud, a fresh scrape on a tree where something large had rubbed against it. I didn't go too far, though. Every direction looked the same, and I wasn't eager to get turned around. When I came back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The ground near the porch had new impressions, shallow but clear. At first, I thought they were my own from the night before, but the tread didn't match my boots. They were longer, thinner, and they led toward the steps. That night, I made sure to secure the door with the old iron latch and stack some firewood against it for good measure. I lay on the cot with the lantern off, staring into the dark, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again, the faint scrape of wood, like a hand dragging along the wall. My chest tightened. I waited, hardly breathing, and the sound moved slowly from the back of the cabin to the side window. The glass rattled softly, then nothing. My heart was beating so loud I thought whoever or whatever was out there would hear it. I stayed frozen until dawn seeped in through the cracks. When I finally forced myself outside, I found more tracks in the dirt. They weren't deep, but they circled the cabin. The ground was disturbed near the window too, like someone had stood there for a while. I felt sick as I stared at them. The woods no longer felt quiet. They felt watchful. I considered leaving right then, but the thought of driving back that long road with someone possibly following me made me hesitate. Instead, I told myself I'd stick it out one more night. The third evening, I barely ate. I kept pacing the cabin, checking the windows, listening. As the fire burned low, I decided I couldn't just sit there waiting. I took my flashlight and the small hatchet I kept near the stove, stepped outside, and walked the perimeter of the clearing. The woods loomed on all sides, dark and endless. My light caught nothing but tree trunks and low brush. I tried to tell myself it was only animals, maybe even kids messing around, though I knew there were no houses anywhere nearby. When I came back around the cabin, I froze. On the porch steps was a small pile of rocks, stacked neatly into a little tower that hadn't been there before. My stomach dropped. It was too deliberate, too quiet. I hadn't heard a thing while circling the clearing. I backed inside, slammed the latch shut, and moved the table against the door. The night that followed was the longest of my life. Every few hours, I heard faint crunches of movement outside, slow and steady, never rushed. Once something tapped against the back wall, 2 knocks spaced apart. Another time, the window creaked as if fingers pressed against it. I stayed in the corner with the hatchet in my lap, my throat dry, waiting for the sound of the door forcing open. It never came, but I knew whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. By the time dawn arrived, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bag in a rush, threw everything into the car, and didn't even look back at the cabin. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I noticed in the rearview mirror a figure standing at the tree line. It was far enough that I couldn't make out details, just a shape, still and upright, watching. I didn't slow down. The drive out felt endless. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. Every curve in the road, I expected a car or truck to block my path, but nothing came. When I finally hit the main highway, the tension in my chest loosened just enough for me to breathe again. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. I never went back to that cabin. My friend asked about it later, but I just told him it wasn't for me. I couldn't explain the tracks, the noises, or the figure without sounding paranoid. But I know what I felt out there. It wasn't animals. It wasn't kids playing around. Someone had been circling that cabin, watching, waiting, making sure I knew I wasn't alone. And the way the rocks had been stacked so quietly, while I was only feet away, proved it. Even now, years later, I think about those nights when I'm alone in a quiet place. How the woods seemed to breathe differently, how every small noise could stretch into something threatening. I think about how easily someone can move unseen when you're surrounded by endless trees. And I know for certain that if I'd stayed one more night, the door wouldn't have just rattled. It would have opened. I was 29 when I decided to spend a weekend away from the city and drive out into the northern woods of Maine. It was early fall in 2012, and the leaves had just begun to change. I told myself I wanted quiet, fresh air, and a break from the routine, but really, I wanted to be alone in a place where no one knew me. My father had passed the year before, and I hadn't been able to stop thinking about him. He used to take me camping when I was a kid, and something about that isolation always stuck with me. I thought maybe if I put myself back in the kind of setting where he felt most alive, I'd be able to clear my own head. The road I took was more like a forgotten trail than a real highway. The pavement ended after an hour and turned into a narrow gravel road, the kind that felt more like it belonged to hunters than anyone else. My little pickup rattled over the rocks as I drove deeper into the trees, past mile after mile of red and orange leaves, fallen branches, and stretches of marshland where the air smelled faintly of rot. Cell service had dropped out a long time ago, and I knew I was pushing into country where I'd have no one to rely on but myself. That thought gave me a strange mix of comfort and unease. I had marked a spot on an old map where I planned to camp by a lake, but as I followed the path, I noticed something that wasn't on my chart. Through the trees, past a line of pines, I caught sight of what looked like a roof line, barely visible through the brush. Curiosity pulled me closer. I parked the truck, grabbed my pack, and pushed my way through the undergrowth until I stood in front of it. The cabin was old, older than anything I had seen still standing in the woods. The logs were dark with age, some split, some rotted at the base, and moss covered half the roof. One shutter dangled on rusted hinges while the others had fallen completely off. A small stone chimney leaned slightly away from the structure, and I could see gaps where daylight must have streamed inside. The place looked like no one had touched it for decades. I stood there for a long while, staring, trying to imagine who had built it and why they had left. The front door was crooked, and when I pushed, it gave way with little effort. The smell hit me first, damp wood, mold, and something like rust. The air was cold and heavy, the kind that clung to your skin. Inside, the cabin was one room, with a collapsed table in the corner, an old iron stove, and piles of decayed boards scattered across the floor. In one corner stood a narrow bed frame with springs sticking up like broken ribs. The floorboards creaked beneath my boots as I stepped in, dust lifting in faint clouds. I told myself I'd only look around, but as I walked the perimeter, I noticed details that made the place feel stranger. There were knife marks etched into the wood of the table, lines crossed over each other so many times I couldn't make sense of them. A shelf by the stove held glass jars, their lids rusted shut, each filled with what looked like dirt or maybe dried beans turned to dust. In the far corner, the bed frame wasn't empty. A rotting blanket clung to it, and beneath that, something solid pressed up. Maybe just old clothes, maybe something else. I didn't check. I stepped back outside to breathe. The woods were quiet, too quiet for that time of day. No bird calls, no wind, nothing but the crunch of leaves under my own boots. I should have left right then, gone back to my truck and driven on, but the thought of staying in that cabin overnight tugged at me. It wasn't smart, but part of me wanted to test myself, to feel the weight of real solitude. I brought my gear in, set up my sleeping bag away from the bed frame, and placed my lantern near the stove. The sun fell early, the light draining from the trees, and by 6 o'clock it was already getting dark. I cooked a small meal on my camp stove, the steam curling up into the rafters, and tried not to stare at the door too often. It wouldn't shut right, and the gaps between the logs let thin streams of night air slide inside. When I finally lay down, every sound felt amplified. The creaks of the cabin shifted with the cooling air. The lantern flame flickered against the walls, making the knife marks on the table look deeper, sharper. I tried to steady my breathing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the place wasn't as empty as it looked. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to a sound that pulled me upright in the sleeping bag. It was the crunch of footsteps outside. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I froze, holding my breath, ears straining. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but the weight of each step told me it wasn't an animal. They circled the cabin, leaves and twigs snapping, moving from one wall to another, pausing, then starting again. I kept the lantern low, afraid to let too much light leak out through the cracks. My pulse thudded in my throat. Then came the scrape, something dragging lightly along the outside wall like a stick or maybe the tip of a blade. It traveled from the back corner all the way to the door. I stared at the crooked wood, knowing it wouldn't hold if someone pushed. Minutes stretched like hours. The steps stopped. The silence pressed down so heavy I could hear the blood in my ears. I stayed still, waiting, every muscle locked. At last, I forced myself to reach for the hatchet I had laid by my pack. My hand shook as I gripped it, the wooden handle slick from sweat. The night dragged on like that. No more footsteps, but I didn't sleep again. Every groan of the cabin made me flinch. When dawn finally seeped through the cracks, I stepped outside with my hatchet still in hand. That's when I saw the prints. In the damp earth just beyond the cabin's edge were clear boot tracks, larger than mine, deep from the weight. They circled the building in a slow, careful path, stopping often, pressing in close to the walls. What froze me most were the marks by the door. 2 spots where someone had stood, side by side, unmoving for what looked like a long time. I didn't pack slowly. I shoved everything into my bag, barely checking to see if I left anything behind. By the time the sun had fully risen, I was back at my truck, tires spitting gravel as I sped down the trail. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again, until I could breathe air that didn't feel trapped in old wood and silence. I never went back. I don't even know exactly where that cabin was now. Somewhere deep enough in the woods that only a hunter or a lost hiker might stumble across it. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw in the dirt. Someone else had been out there, watching, waiting, circling while I slept inside. And the thought that I only found the cabin by chance means whoever still walks those woods might still be waiting for the next person curious enough to step inside.